The LEC 2024 season finals weekend was incredible. MDK and Fnatic, teams that have had high highs and low lows across the last 2 years, seem to finally be peaking to the level that has been promised for so long at the most crucial point of the year at the exact same time, no less. Both teams displayed stellar individual laning and role improvements, outclassing the likes of consistent third-place teams like BDS, for example, or managing to keep up and even outclassing the individuals of G2, the undisputed best team in EU. After MDK and Fnatic went to Game 5 in another explosive series that was beyond entertaining, and with G2 underperforming in every single series they have played so far in season finals, going into the final weekend, it felt like for the first time in 2 years that any of these three teams could win the most important trophy of the year. Could MDK prove that they deserve to be in season finals? That they deserve to go to Worlds? Prove Elyoya's statement that lower expectations for rookies are just excuses to underperform, and that this insanely risky project could actually pay off with a win that we were teased all the way back in winter? Could Fnatic, a team that according to G2 was the only team they lost to in scrims when they went to MSI?
They're the hardest team for us to play against. They're one of the strongest teams we're playing.
A team who is clearly competitive with G2 behind the scenes. A team that before this summer had not been on the winner's side of LEC finals since LEC summer of 2020. Could Fnatic finally, after showing so much confidence in interviews,
I feel like we can beat both. I just want to beat G2, man.
Deliver Fnatic fans the long-awaited 6 years in the making LEC Championship trophy? Would Mad Lions shock the world by beating G2 twice in season finals, silencing the haters once and for all by winning this tournament and being EU's first seed at Worlds again like they were in 2021? Would Fnatic conquer the demon that has chased them the entire year as they have failed to defeat G2 in a series when it matters most? The answer is no. G2 won season finals. As much as I would love to do a recap of every game from this weekend, and they were all truly incredible games, I can't. Also, side note, I Will Dominate literally bitched all of summer playoffs that he was going to quit the LEC after this year, and I bet money that after this finals, he is going to keep watching because these games were undeniable. What? All three teams really stepped their game up. All the games were incredibly exciting without being embarrassments from either side. Maybe MDK looked a little lost in that last game versus G2, but that Fnatic G2 series was insanity. Both teams knew what they were doing. All 10 players played out of their minds. I was blown away and am incredibly excited and hopeful that all three teams will do well at Worlds. But now that all that's out of the way, what I really want to talk about in this video is G2. Because honestly, what I have to say about them has been a long time coming. In a previous video, I made a statement that G2 2024 is better than G2 2019. And although many disagreed, I still stand by my statement. And in this video, I intend to prove exactly that. Some quick history. Fnatic in 2018 unexpectedly made it to Worlds Finals, where they went up against Invictus Gaming, a team that was not projected to do well at Worlds, so going into that finals, almost everyone predicted that Fnatic would win the series, and thus Worlds for the first time ever since Korea and China have been a part of the World Tournament. But then Fnatic choked Horde and got 0-3'd, and as the story goes, Caps was approached by Perkz, who offered to role swap from mid to AD carry so that him and Caps could be on the same team. What I find most interesting about this is that according to Legend, Perkz said something along the lines of, "Do you want to win Worlds then join us. Which is pretty crazy coming from a G2 that didn't do so hot in Summer or Worlds of 2018. Fnatic was a super strong team at the time, but alas, Caps was seemingly sold on the dream of a G2 super team that could be one of the greatest super teams ever created. You had the two players who were far and away better than the other 8 mid laners in the LEC at the time, and instead of continuing to challenge each other split after split, they decided to join forces. It was a unique and unprecedented move. I really cannot highlight that enough, and it paid off. G2 2019 was historic. They dominated domestically with a 13-5 and 15-3 regular season finishes in spring and summer respectively. And playoffs were often a piece of cake. Spring, for example, they 3-0'd Origin twice for a flawless spring playoffs championship. And in summer, although they went to 5 games in both their series, they would still beat Fnatic twice and secure back-to-back championships, dominating domestically for all of 2019. And I haven't even mentioned that in 2019, G2 would go to MSI and beat SKT in the knockout phase in an explosive 5-game series. And then they would win a historically fast finals against Team Liquid 3-0 to secure the first international trophy for EU and the West since the East had been included in international events. G2 would go into Worlds of 2019 with the rare opportunity of accomplishing the Golden Road. Before 2019, only 3 teams have ever come close, winning 3 of 4 events, but still ultimately failing the Golden Road. SKT in 2015 placed 2nd at MSI, 2016 SKT placed 3rd in summer playoffs, and 2018 RNG would lose in the quarterfinals of Worlds. G2 would make an incredible run to the finals, beating Damwon Gaming and SKT 3-1, beating 2 incredibly strong teams, and winning 3-1 just made those wins feel extra definitive. When G2 made finals, they were officially the closest any team had ever been in competitive League of Legends history to achieving the Golden Road. However, unfortunately, as I am sure many of you know, G2, despite the historic run so far, despite the unprecedented role swap that allowed Caps and Perkz to unite, they would lose 0-3 to FunPlus Phoenix in the finals, a tragically poetic repeat of where Caps found himself in 2018 with Fnatic. Despite the loss at Worlds, what you need to know is that 2019 G2 was something genuinely special. I know I tend to overhype EU a lot when arguably we're in a little bit of a low point.
Welcome to MCU, by the way. You're joining at a bit of a low point.
But truly, this was a super team. Perkz was the best mid laner in EU from 2016 to 2017. Was known not only as a fantastic player, but also as a leader behind the scenes who added so much intangible value to G2 that by 2019, he was celebrated by many as EU's greatest player of all time. Wonder, Jankos, and Mickey X were the best top jungle and support respectively in EU for all of 2019 and were so dominant that they could literally carry through any lane or role, which is not common. Many times teams have to find an identity, a specific player or role to play through. G2 was brimming with so much raw talent at the time that they could play off-meta champs, new styles week to week, and still be leagues ahead of every other team. And finally, add Caps, the prodigy mid called Baby Faker at the time. The player who Perkz, who remember was called EU's GOAT at the time, stepped aside for in recognition that in terms of raw talent as a mid laner, Caps was simply superior. Adding Caps to this roster was putting an X factor on an already overpowered team. All of this is why G2 2019 is still spoken about to this day. Meanwhile, 2018 Fnatic, who also won back-to-back splits and made it to Worlds Finals, is never mentioned ever. This roster was borderline once in a lifetime for the West. We had never seen a roster like this one before, and we have never seen a roster as strong ever since, is what I would say if not for G2 2023. G2 in 2022 had strong but internationally unproven Broken Blade in the top lane, historic supportive jungler Jankos in jungle, Caps who needs no introduction in the mid lane, and rookies Flakked and Targamas in the bot lane. At the time, I thought it was interesting to see G2 invest in rookies after they had been notoriously poaching EU's best talent from other teams split after split for years. I expected G2 needed time before winning anything, but shockingly, they went on an unbelievable undefeated losers run in spring playoffs of 2022. They also had a strong showing at 2022 MSI. I feel like fans are so harsh when G2 doesn't just dominate internationally, but just as a reminder, they went 8-0 in their first group, not dropping a single game to EG, then took games from RNG and T1 in the second group stage, and again with a roster with 2 rookies on it. Compare their performance to EG, who could not beat G2 even once, couldn't beat RNG once, and only beat T1 in one single game. That is a 1-9 record against EU, Korea, and China combined at that MSI for EG. A team with Impact, Inspired, Jojo, Danny, and Vulcan. All impressive NA talent who should be able to at least compete with G2, and arguably a weaker G2 at that, but they still simply couldn't. G2 had a more dominant start to summer, but shockingly fell to Rogue in the finals 0-3. And perhaps due to that shocking loss, G2 looked like a shell of themselves at Worlds. They lost to EG for the first time across that entire year. They didn't make it out of groups, and quickly after the loss, they announced that they would be letting go of rookie AD carry Flakked and longtime jungler Jankos. Flakked was to be replaced by Hans Sama, and I could not be more disappointed. Hans Sama was always a player I saw to be less impressive than Upset or Reckless, for example. Someone who I always heard hype about, but never saw the potential beyond the occasional highlight outplay that I felt fans were putting way too much weight on. In 2022, Hans Sama went to Team Liquid and was heavily criticized due to his radical decline in level, and this TL was supposed to be a super team with some of EU's best talent on this NA roster. But ultimately, they failed horribly, not even making Worlds in 2022. 2022 was also the year that Carlos was removed from G2, and strictly on an esports level, I was admittedly extremely concerned because I felt that without Carlos, G2 might lose some of their identity. For better or for worse, G2 has always been a team first and foremost concerned with winning. And they did win across radically different iterations. They would make decisions in the offseason that fans, myself included, did not always understand at the time, but they would pay off time and time again. But going with Hans Sama felt like a huge downgrade in my opinion. Maybe on paper, and maybe at the moment, Hans Sama would be an improvement over Flakked. And remember, Hans Sama was coming off of an awful year individually, so even that was not a guarantee. But for argument's sake, let's say it was a guaranteed temporary improvement, at least to some extent. Would that be more than developing Flakked further when he showed enough promise to help the team win a championship and could potentially develop into a top 80 carry? And add to that Hans Sama requested Mikyx, who had a decent but somewhat disappointing year with XL where they could only peak at 6th place. Had Hans Sama not made this specific request, G2 was going to keep Targamas, the player who I felt was actually the more promising of the 2 rookies, and was actually certain that he was going to develop into the next Mikyx, especially because of his versatility with so many different champions in 2022, and his roaming support playstyle that even did well internationally. Jankos was initially supposed to be replaced by Elyoya, which is still the universe that I wish I lived in, but that's besides the point. However, despite agreeing to pay the initially proposed buyout of 800k to Mad Lions to break Elyoya's contract, Mad Lions would come back with a request of 1.1 million, which G2 then declined and instead went with their second choice, the hottest rookie on the market and 2-time LFL champion of 2022, Yike from LDLC. Now, as much as I love Jankos, the jungle change was at least acceptable to me. Jankos had been on the team for so long, and Caps wanted to try a jungler with a different style. However, I was incredibly concerned and disappointed by the bot changes G2 were making. I felt like G2 was going for less risk but more consistent expectations. A lower opportunity to dominate EU for a better chance of consistently placing top 3, let's say. G2 always represented trying to win above all else. Fuck budget restraints, fuck morals, honors, sportsmanship around poaching. They did what it took to win. Not only in EU either, but actually always had their sights set on doing well internationally on top of that. These leaked roster changes felt like the exact opposite of what G2 stood for to me in EU. And it was especially worrying since EU had also been declining in terms of international performances, which is a huge topic that I can't get into right now. I got a huge video cooking on it, I promise. And since G2 felt like the sole pillar of EU's international ambitions, the thought of G2 even taking a slight step back from that goal felt like a tragedy to me. Oh, how wrong I was. It turns out that although Carlos was certainly a part of G2's roster choices in the past, and identity around winning above all else, many interviews with former G2 staff and players have made it clear that by now, G2 is 1, still committed to those previously mentioned values even without Carlos, and 2, this is virtually just Caps' team. What Caps wants, he gets. He specifically asked for a replacement to Jankos because he felt he needed a change in the mid-jungle dynamic, particularly a jungler who could confidently and predominantly carry. Whereas Jankos' specialty was more around supportive jungling. Hearing that Hans Sama joining the team was also a Caps request specifically did help me accept that decision as well. Going into 2023, there was a lot of talk around G2 looking stronger than ever. Specifically, Broken Blade in the Winter 2023 teaser said he had never won so many scrims in his career before. And immediately, by the first week of Winter, we got to see just how true that sentiment was, as G2 dominated the rest of the LEC with record-breaking wins. And the craziest part was that Broken Blade and Caps, especially Caps, the two carries of G2 for all of 2022, were not even massive parts of these incredibly dominant wins. Hans and Mickey X were destroying every other bot lane, consistently getting the push, which allowed Mickey X to apply pressure to the enemy jungle, which then allowed carry jungler Yike to invade and steal camps and secure kills, and they would often dive bot with a level 4 Yike and just steamroll and snowball games into some of the consistently fastest and most dominant wins we had seen in the LEC in a while. Immediately, this G2 iteration was compared to 2019 G2. Even the most pessimistic of commentators like LS, I Will Dominate, and Thorin were hyping up this roster and even began to speculate how G2 would contend against the Eastern teams. They were so far ahead of the rest of the LEC that it was said that having them play in the LEC was a waste of their talents. There was even a joke made by, I believe, Yamato Cannon, where he suggested that G2 just run an ERL team in the LEC and send the main roster to Korea to play in the LCK, because that would be a better and more efficient use of the talent on this team. It was thought that they would start no less than top 6, and that after a year in the LCK, they could end the year as possible title contenders. These were all real things that the often pessimistic content creators in the scene were saying about this lineup. And even after losing Spring, G2 had built up so much credit in the brand new short winter split that many considered the Mad Lions win to be a fluke and not representative of perhaps overhyping G2 a little bit. There was still so much excitement and anticipation around what they could do at MSI. And at MSI, they did well in the new play-in stage. But upon making it to the official bracket, they would lose to Gen G 1-3 and BLG in losers 1-3. Still, promising performances, but ultimately a disappointment. And after the loss in Spring, G2's hype had certainly diminished, and they were almost back to square one. They would have to prove to fans that they were still the best team in Europe by far. And in proving that would then show that they had the potential to make a deep run at Worlds. So as summer 2023 approached, G2 came back with a vengeance. They went 8-1 in the regular season, they 2-0'd KOI and BDS in the group stage, and then went through a crazy 5-game series against XL, and despite the close call, they would remove any doubt that they were the better team by 3-0ing XL in the summer finals. And by season finals, they 3-1'd BDS, Mad Lions, and Fnatic to definitively finish first in both summer and season finals and reclaimed their undisputed position as the best team in Europe by far. G2 did not slow down or look shaky after summer like they did after winter. Instead of experimenting and limit testing in season finals after a dominant win in summer, they locked in harder than ever to really ramp up for what they had hoped to be a successful World Championship. Worlds 2023 comes and G2 looks promising. G2 beat Damwon Kia Plus, aka D Plus Kia, aka Damwon Gaming Kia Plus, which was a massive win to start the tournament. They then beat Weibo, the team which, without getting too far ahead of myself, would later be the second place team of all of Worlds 2023. But as G2 began to enter the elimination phase of the new Swiss format, things started to change. G2 would lose 0-2 to Gen G, but this was a fair loss. Gen G was the first seed coming from the LCK and were without a doubt a strong team. However, NRG was NA's unexpected first seed after they upset Team Liquid and Cloud9 in the LCS Summer Finals. Many felt that NRG was not the best the LCS had to offer, and they were going up against G2, the team that was considered in contention to win international tournaments. And then NRG 2-0'd G2? I don't think I need to explain just how bad this loss was. G2 was getting clowned on hard. I am sure that this loss killed a lot of their confidence. And they needed all the confidence they could muster because they were about to go up against BLG, China's second seed at this tournament. This series was the closest of the 3 best of 3s G2 played at Worlds. They won game 2, but ultimately lost 1-2, meaning this team, who was compared to G2 of 2019, the team that fans hoped would restore EU to its former glory, make a deep run at Worlds, and perhaps even win the entire tournament, were out before the knockout stage even began. This was heartbreaking. But after watching the behind the scenes documentary, it sounds like a few members of the team, Broken Blade specifically, had gotten sick before their important best of 3 qualification matches. And in the words of Romain, it fucking sucks. Your entire year being defined by a single day where you guys were understandably off, despite how much they dominated through the entire year, one bad day is all they would be remembered for regarding this world tournament. But also, like Romain said, such is the nature of competition. Despite this heartbreak, G2 would announce quickly that they were not going to make any changes to this G2 roster, and I was beyond proud of them for doing so. With so many memes and trolls, especially regarding the loss to NRG, I could totally see if G2 had a more detached upper management, they would request changes. I could see Caps, who had now missed 2 quarterfinals in a row, which was also following a 2021 where he also missed Worlds, that he would begin to feel hopeless. It would be understandable if he was having doubts, and it would be more than acceptable if he requested changes. Perhaps to Broken Blade, who had been criticized over and over again as not being world class. Perhaps Caps would ask for Elyoya again, who was now a free agent and would not have to go through any buyout clause, and he would theoretically be an upgrade from Yike, similar to how after 2022 he requested Hansama over the promising rookie Flack. I could see for so many reasons this squad, who was hyped to do so much internationally that ultimately failed to do much of anything, blowing up in favor of trying something new. And thank God they didn't. You all are probably more familiar with 2024 G2 at this point. They won everything domestically. They came out of the gate swinging in winter and won dominantly, but did not repeat the mistakes of spring 2023 and instead kept their foot on the gas and won spring 2024, which allowed them to enter MSI with confidence as EU's #1 representative. At MSI 2024, they took T1, defending 2023 world champions and runner-ups in LCK Spring Finals, to 5 games. And a close 5 games at that. This was what we had been promised for so long. In the losers bracket, they would go up against PSG Talon, the team that 2-0'd NA's promising second seed FlyQuest and took BLG, China's first seed and eventual second place team at this tournament, to 5 games. So they were certainly no slouches. And at this tournament, G2 3-0'd them. They then 3-0'd Top Esports, China's second seed at the tournament. And that was a statement win. And although they would get 3-0'd by T1 in the rematch in the losers bracket, this is just another example of how sometimes going over the results doesn't tell the whole story. These were close games. They were competitive. And despite the loss, G2 showed across this entire MSI that they could contend with the East. And similar to what I said about Winter 2023 G2, it wasn't even Caps or Mickey X, the established world-class players of G2, that popped off at this tournament. It was second-year Yike and internationally criticized Broken Blade who showed up and delivered world-class performances against some of the best teams and players in the world. It felt like after the 3-0 against T1, fans were once again doubting G2, but for me, I could not feel more different. This was G2 showing that they could beat anyone. Mark our words. Summer and season finals were mirror images of each other. Summer, G2 finished the regular season 7-2. They 2-0'd KC and BDS. Then in winners finals would lose to Fnatic in an amazing 5-game series, but would come back with a vengeance in a notorious 3-0 sweep in the finals, where they showed their masterful ability to come back from virtually any deficit due to their strong emphasis on mid to late game macro this year. In season finals, they unexpectedly lost to massive underdogs MDK. Go watch my last video about that series. In a tense 5-game series that immediately had EU fans speculating that G2 was off their form and perhaps, like 2023, would have one domestic blemish on their record. Though, instead of it being a meaningless spring split, it would be here at the most important domestic tournament of the year. However, all of those doubters, hilariously myself included, should shut their mouths in shame for doubting this team that has showed up every single time that it matters. In Munich, G2 would go 3-1 against MDK and Fnatic and win season finals, establishing what I like to call a domestic Grand Slam, which, by the way, is actually way more impressive than ever before, because G2 now has to peak 4 times in this new format across a single year, instead of previously where you only had to peak twice to win spring and summer splits. With having to be the best across multiple patches, across shorter sprints of time, there are just so many more opportunities to fail if you are off your game for even just 2 weeks. So that brings us to today. G2 just completed a domestic Grand Slam and are headed to Worlds once again as EU's undisputed best team and an undeniable contender for the World Championship. I genuinely feel that G2 has the potential to win Worlds this year. And honestly, I truly believe this iteration of G2 is stronger than G2 2019. For one, since 2020, the gap between EU and the East has seemingly grown. And although there are a lot of opinions and explanations for this, one popular idea is that the East has dramatically improved their understanding of the game regarding macro decision making. And that is, 1, never been EU or the West's strong suit, and 2, only gotten arguably worse because, in my opinion, macro is something that takes time for all 5 players on a team to learn and really synergize on. But for some reason, EU teams just make changes so frequently that it is honestly impossible for any roster to develop that high-level macro. In the G2 Worlds 2020 documentary, One Last Try, Wunder mentioned that 2020 Worlds felt more important to them because 2019 felt like they were just dominating individually with outplays in micro skirmishes and team fights. But in 2020, they began to better understand when to fight and why they should or should not take fights. That's macro. And that very same macro is what they attribute their loss to against Damwon in the semifinals. They said that that loss in the semifinals was not one of G2 not showing up on the day. It was just a team diff. And it wasn't just that Showmaker, Canyon, Nuguri, Ghost, and Beryl have better mechanics. I guess I do have to admit that they did have better mechanics than G2, but I think it was way more about how they played with their waves and camps, how they set up and fought around objectives, aka how they played the macro side of the game. In separate interviews with Perkz and Sven, former players of G2, they both mentioned how on G2 2017 when they played together, and once again on Cloud9 2021 when they played together, they were the types of players who were more concerned about outplaying specific skirmishes. Meanwhile, Coach and former G2 support Mithy was always more concerned with should they be taking said fight. And it was such a difference in opinion around how the game should be played that Cloud9 in 2021 had disputes that led to Sven being benched at one point. The point in bringing all this up is that although G2 2019 was absolutely stacked, they were not by any means playing the macro of League all that well. Maybe you could argue that they were good on a macro level too, but I would say it definitely was not why they were so much better than the rest of the teams they went up against all year. G2 2023 was actually extremely similar to G2 2019 in this way. They didn't dominate by out-macroing their opponents, it was entirely through outplaying their enemies individually in skirmishes and team fights. And although they dominated domestically, the results internationally were extremely disappointing. Mickey early on in Winter 2024 said that after being eliminated from Worlds, he met up with former G2 coach Duffman, who was actually working on C9 at the time. And after both of them were eliminated from Worlds, they met up, went on a mini post-Worlds vacation, and Duffman pointed out a lot of macro mistakes G2 were making that if corrected, G2 could potentially see radical levels of improvement. Duffman would rejoin G2 this year, and with him, G2 redirected their focus from winning early game skirmishes to snowball games into a more mid-game macro-focused style that has, 1, allowed them to come back from deficits in games all year, and 2, shown them to stand a better chance against Eastern teams. Now, obviously, as any competitive game or sport develops, the level of play is naturally going to improve. It is undeniable that if somehow G2 2024 could play a best of 5 against G2 2019, 2024 would win every day of the week, and that is simply because of this reason alone. And that proves my initial point, but I actually want to take it a step further. I genuinely feel that each member of 2024 G2 has an argument for being better than their 2019 counterparts. And that's with respect to the level of competition surrounding them, both domestically and internationally. Broken Blade sincerely deserves so much more credit than he gets. He used to dominate on strong side picks, unorthodox picks, lane bullies, etc. domestically. But then internationally, even in winning matchups, most famously playing Fiora into Nuguri's Sejuani in Worlds 2022, he would typically lose lane and look useless come mid-game. However, he showed moments of potential as early as MSI 2023 especially, and this year, upon winning Winter, he made sure to shout out Alphari, former LEC pro top laner who often had the narrative of never losing lane.
I want to give a huge shout out to Alphari, who has been helping me throughout this split.
Even when Bwipo and Wunder were the top dogs of EU, Bwipo gave credit to Alphari, saying that at the very least he could compete at their level in lane, and he was worthwhile practice for either side of a top lane matchup he wanted to practice. This MSI 2024, BB showed he was able to beat Eastern top laners in lane, establishing leads, playing well in team fights, and carrying games. So many players don't get the opportunity to improve. So many with the opportunity do not improve. It is so special to see a player who has been doubted so much throughout their career, which is so discouraging, to ignore that hate and instead concentrate on the work and get to a level where he is now world class and a genuine threat on the international stage. Broken Blade, if you're listening, I cannot tell you how much respect I have for you, not only because of how much you've leveled up, but specifically how impressive it is to be at the level you are now. Yike does not get the credit that he deserves because he is on G2. He is on the team with pretty much the best player in EU in every role surrounding him, and as such, he does not necessarily stand out all the time. But one, many pros themselves have said that it can actually be easier to stand out when you're on a bad team. And when he went to MSI, he was the other carry with BB that literally won them games against T1, Top Esports, and PSG. Not only did he bring the carry style that Caps was initially looking for, but he also brought the versatility to play supportive setup junglers as the team needed. And for a player in his second year to be showing world-class levels of play across a variety of champions and playstyles just goes to show that Yike is undeniably a world-class jungler. Not a specific champion merchant, not a one-trick, but a genuinely talented jungler who enhances his team a lot. Caps needs no introduction, but what I will say is that in 2019, his gap between himself and the other mids was mostly mechanical. But now are in 2024 where you have mechanical mids like Fresskowy, Vizio, Humanoid, and Niski, but you, one, still outclass them mechanically, if only by a smaller margin, but in the modern day that is incredibly impressive, and two, add an incredible understanding of macro, which when you're watching G2, do you ever notice that Caps is the one usually pushing side lane and getting towers while the rest of G2 contests an objective and buys them some time? These plays by Caps are usually what allows them to make comebacks and close out games. Caps may not seem as dominant mechanically, but I think that has to do more with the competition rising rather than him losing a step. So the fact that he is still the best mid in EU is unbelievably impressive. Hans Sama for a while has been my biggest criticism of this G2 roster across the last 2 years. And honestly, I really do regret feeling that way. Especially watching this season finals, there are so many moments that Hans Sama is finding picks as an AD carry. He is undeniably incredible in lane, a carry that G2 can rely on and play through. He is still underrated in my opinion, and when you compare him to Perkz, who was off-rolled during the 2019 run, Hans is absolutely an upgrade, and he's vocal too, a trait that is rare in AD carries. I will be looking at Hans specifically at this World Tournament, not because I'm looking for him to impress me or justify his place on this team, but rather because I expect him to, because I know that is what he is capable of, and that is what he will deliver. And Mikyx rounds out this team as the other player along with Caps who was on 2019 G2. Especially as a support, having macro be such a focus of this team and support being responsible for setting up vision control, which is crucial in the mid game, I think it is fair to say Mikyx is better than he was in 2019, undoubtedly. For some reason, he has looked somewhat shaky this year, but in the finals in Munich, my God, he was smurfing. Something said, I believe by Dylan and Duffman in the Euphoria podcast, is that although they are proud of their players for being consistent with their practice and improvement throughout the entire long year that has been 2024, it is natural that they will really step it up when their backs are against the wall and the stakes are at their highest. So although it doesn't look as effortlessly dominant as it has in the past, it is clear that when 2024 G2 needs to, they can level up in order to win the games they have to. I would much rather have a team that doesn't look dominant all year, but knows how to peak at the most important part of the year, rather than a team that smurfs domestically, but either burns out or looks unprepared during the toughest moments of Worlds. As always, I spoke way more than I meant to, and I cut a lot from this script, believe it or not. I will be talking about G2 sometime in the future, so just as a preview, so we have it on the record now, I adore this team. Spiritually, I do root for MDK just a slight bit more, but G2 I know logically is the better team, of course, and when it comes to international events, I want to see all of EU's representatives do well. And for that reason, I root heavy for G2 since they are always our best team. G2 over the last 2 years have competed in the most grueling schedule so far in the world. 2 years with 4 domestic tournaments respectively, and they have won 7 out of 8, which is just fucking ridiculous. They have had the least breaks of any team so far, as they have competed in MSI and Worlds both years. Add to that this year they had the last minute Esports World Cup, which really can just drain any team. Even T1 right now is being given a lot of leeway because of how much they have had to travel, train, and compete with virtually no breaks at all across 2 or 3 years at this point. Even if G2 2024 does not win Worlds, even if they don't make Worlds finals, semifinals, or dare I say even quarterfinals, which I don't think will happen, but if they don't make it, and even if they break up after this year, which I sincerely don't know who they could or would replace, but if they did, I will be sad, but I will never forget this roster. These players have shown a level of dedication and discipline that is honestly unfathomable. If you are an EU fan, they deserve your support. I truly believe there has never been a better team coming from the West than G2 2024. And guess what? I think they're going to win Worlds. Thank you to my patrons, RJVZZ, Bob Bulaman, Kevin Gayonet, how would you like me to pronounce this? Trent, aka Lettuce Plate on Twitch, Adam D, and Ruben Farley. Thank you all so much for your support on this channel, and if you would like to support this channel and receive a shout out at the end of the video, or join as a free member where I provide updates on upcoming videos and potentially access to my Discord channel, we'll talk about that later, then please do consider checking out my Patreon, subscribing as a free member, or giving $5 a month, as it really does help out the channel, and all the money is going right back into the production of future videos. Finally, shout out to Mauricio, aka Mouty, for editing this video. Definitely show him some love in the comments. Yeah, and with all that, I will get back to you all soon, because otherwise I will talk for another 10 minutes. Peace out, everybody.